At Ethan Whitmore's engagement party, glittering with 300 guests beneath crystal chandeliers, Vanessa Sterling ripped a champagne tray from Naomi Carter's hands. She shoved the maid backward, then swung her palm toward Naomi's face in front of everyone. The slap never landed. Naomi caught Vanessa's wrist in midair, pivoted on one heel, and sent her crashing to the marble floor in a single controlled motion. The ballroom fell silent. Every guest stared at the maid they had ignored for years, suddenly wondering the same terrifying question: who was she really? If stories like this keep you hooked, hit subscribe and stay with us, because what happens next in this ballroom is only the beginning. The slap that never landed would come later. Before that moment, Naomi Carter's life inside the Whitmore estate was built on a much quieter kind of discipline. Every morning she pressed the same pink and white uniform, tied her hair back the same way, and walked through the marble halls of the mansion as though she had never existed anywhere else. Guests who visited the estate on weekends rarely looked at her twice. She refilled glasses, folded linens, and disappeared into corners of rooms so easily that some of the wealthiest families in Boston could not have described her face if asked. That invisibility had never come naturally to her. It was something she built brick by brick after years of being seen in exactly the wrong way. Long before she wore a maid's uniform, people had already decided who she was the moment she walked into a room, and she had grown tired of correcting them. So instead, she learned to vanish. She kept her voice low, her opinions quieter, and her body language small enough that no one would ask questions she did not want to answer. What none of the Whitmores or their guests could have guessed was that Naomi had once spent 8 years training in close combat and defensive martial arts, guided by an instructor who ran a private academy for bodyguards and protection specialists. She had been one of his most promising students, someone capable of disarming a grown man twice her size in under 3 seconds. That version of her belonged to a life she had deliberately closed the door on, after an assignment years earlier had ended in violence. She still refused to speak about, even to herself. Only the final 3 years of that training had ever gone undocumented anywhere, a stretch of time she had spent living under a different name inside the Academy's residential program, cut off from any paperwork that could trace her back to an ordinary life. She had made a promise after that last assignment, one she repeated to herself often in the quiet hours of cleaning empty rooms. Her hands would never be used as weapons again, unless there was truly no other choice left. Taking a job as a maid was not a step down from that old life. For Naomi, it was a doorway into something she had never fully had before, a version of her days that felt calm, ordinary, and entirely her own. That calm was interrupted, gently at first, by a man who was not supposed to notice her at all. Ethan Whitmore, the 33-year-old heir to his family's real estate empire, had a habit of coming down to the kitchen long after the rest of the house had gone quiet. One night, after a brutal call with the company's board, he found Naomi finishing the last of the wine glasses, arranging them upside down on a drying towel in perfect rows. He did not order her to bring him anything. He simply pulled out a stool at the counter and asked if she minded company. Naomi told him she did not, though she kept working, drying each glass with the same unhurried rhythm as before. Ethan admitted that one of the company's largest shareholders had just threatened to pull his support unless Ethan started acting more like what the family expected of him. He laughed as he said it, but there was no real humor in his voice, only exhaustion dressed up as a joke. He told her that some nights he felt like nothing more than a name printed on legal documents, not an actual person anyone bothered to know. Naomi set down the glass she was holding and looked at him directly, something she rarely allowed herself to do with anyone in that house. She told him that if that was how he felt, he needed to find somewhere, even for 10 minutes a day, where he could simply be a person instead of a name. Ethan laughed again, but this time it reached his eyes, and for a moment the tired lines on his face eased into something lighter. It was a short conversation, nothing dramatic, nothing that would have made sense to anyone watching from the doorway. But it told Ethan something he had not realized he was missing. He came to Naomi not because she served him, but because she was one of the only people left in his life who spoke to him as though he were simply a man standing in a kitchen at midnight, not an empire waiting to be inherited. Those late-night conversations became a quiet ritual between them over the following months. Ethan never treated Naomi the way most of his circle treated the staff, and that alone made him different from almost every wealthy person she had encountered in her years of service. He remembered her name without being reminded, thanked her when she brought him coffee, and never spoke to her as though she were furniture that happened to move on its own. What grew between them was not a romance. It was something rarer and in some ways more dangerous, an honest connection neither of them had expected to find inside a house built on appearances. That connection existed alongside another relationship entirely, one far more complicated. Ethan was engaged to Vanessa Sterling, a woman who had grown up inside private clubs, family jets, and a world that quietly ranked people the moment they walked through a door. Vanessa knew exactly how to charm men with power, and exactly how to look past anyone without it. To most of the guests who came through the Whitmore estate, she was warm, gracious, and endlessly composed. To the staff who worked there every day, she was someone to be avoided whenever possible. What almost no one around Vanessa understood was how much of her composure had been built the same way Naomi's invisibility had, out of necessity rather than nature. Vanessa's mother, a well-known figure in Boston society herself, had raised her daughter to believe that her value existed only as long as she remained a marriage worth making. Vanessa had never once been loved for simply being herself. She had been groomed, polished, and evaluated for what she represented, and she had learned early that affection in her world was always conditional. So when Vanessa began to notice that Ethan seemed lighter, calmer, and more himself around a maid than he had ever been around her, something old and painful in her cracked open. It was not simply jealousy, though jealousy played its part. It was the terrifying possibility that despite every advantage she had been given, despite years of careful self-perfection, she still might not be enough to be loved honestly. Rather than face that fear directly, Vanessa did what she had been taught to do with anything that threatened her control. She found a way to make it smaller. Naomi became her target almost immediately, though never in a way that could be easily named or reported. Vanessa began requiring Naomi to redo tasks that had already been completed correctly, checking rooms after Naomi had cleaned them, as if searching for evidence of wrongdoing. She quietly implied to other staff that Naomi could not be trusted around the family's belongings, planting suspicion without ever making a direct accusation that could be challenged. In front of guests, Vanessa's comments were always polished just enough to sound harmless. She would remind Naomi, in a voice sweet enough to disarm anyone listening, that she should be grateful to work in a house like this one. Other times she mentioned, almost as an aside, that there were certain rooms not everyone was meant to belong in. Once, she told Naomi directly not to mistake Ethan's kindness for any kind of place within the family, a warning delivered with a smile that never touched her eyes. Naomi understood quickly that this was not simple jealousy playing out in isolated moments. Vanessa had already built a complete picture of who Naomi was, long before she had bothered to learn anything true about her. That picture had nothing to do with the woman standing in front of her, and everything to do with the fears Vanessa refused to examine in herself. That certainty deepened when Vanessa, going through employee records under the pretense of routine household security, discovered 3 years missing from Naomi's documented history. To Vanessa, missing years meant only one thing: something Naomi was hiding, likely something dangerous or criminal. Rather than asking a single direct question or requesting a simple explanation, Vanessa treated the gap as proof of everything she already suspected, using it to justify a hostility she had been building for months. She had no way of knowing that those 3 missing years were the final, most demanding stretch of the combat training. Naomi had spent nearly a decade completing the very skills that would one day humiliate her in front of 300 guests. Not long after that discovery, during a family dinner where Vanessa made another quiet remark about the household staff, Harold Whitmore, the 91-year-old founder of the family fortune, set down his wine glass with a small, deliberate motion. He said simply that he had lived long enough to know that the way a person treated those who served them revealed more about their character than any introduction ever could. The table went quiet. Ethan glanced at his grandfather with unmistakable respect, while Vanessa forced a laugh and move the conversation elsewhere as quickly as she could. What no one at that table noticed, except perhaps Harold himself, was the brief moment his gaze lingered on Naomi as she stood near the doorway, waiting to clear the plates. It was a short look, nothing anyone would think to mention later, but it carried something more attentive than casual observation, as though the old man had noticed something in her that the rest of the family had spent years failing to see. As the household began preparing for the engagement party, an event expected to draw 300 guests, including business leaders, politicians, and members of the media, tension inside the estate tightened, like a wire pulled too far. The night before the party, Vanessa cornered Naomi just outside the ballroom, her voice low enough that no one else could hear but sharp enough to leave. No room for misunderstanding. She accused Naomi of deliberately trying to seduce Ethan, twisting months of quiet kitchen conversations into something ugly and calculated. Then she delivered a warning meant to end the conversation entirely. Tomorrow, in front of everyone who mattered in this city, she would make sure Naomi remembered exactly where she belonged. Naomi answered calmly, without raising her voice or breaking eye contact, telling Vanessa that she had never once forgotten who she was. Vanessa assumed this was simply a reference to Naomi's role in the household, an acknowledgement of her place as staff. She had no idea that Naomi was speaking about something far older and far more dangerous than a job title, a truth she had spent years trying to leave behind her. Naomi understood, standing there in the hallway, that Vanessa fully intended to humiliate her publicly the next evening, in front of an audience large enough to make the damage permanent. She faced a decision that had nothing to do with fear and everything to do with the life she had chosen to build. She could continue staying quiet, protecting the peaceful existence she had worked so hard to create, or she could refuse, for the first time in years, to make herself smaller simply because someone else demanded it. By the time she walked back to her room that night, Naomi had made her decision. She would still show up the next evening and do her job as she always had, offering no confrontation, starting no conflict of her own. But she would not stand silently through whatever Vanessa was planning to do to her, not this time. Whatever happened in that ballroom, she would not disappear again. The ballroom had been transformed for the engagement party into something almost unreal, with crystal chandeliers throwing soft light across marble floors and 300 guests moving between round tables draped in white linen. Waiters circulated with trays of champagne, string musicians played somewhere near the far wall, and every surface in the room seemed to shimmer with the kind of wealth that rarely announced itself so loudly. Naomi moved through it all in her uniform, carrying trays, refilling glasses, and doing precisely what she had told herself the night before. Her job, nothing more. Nothing that would give Vanessa an excuse to start something in public. She kept her eyes down more than usual that evening, avoiding Ethan whenever she could manage it without appearing rude. It was not difficult, given how many guests wanted his attention, business partners and family friends pulling him from one conversation to the next as the party moved deeper into the evening. Naomi told herself that if she simply kept her head down and her hands busy, the night would end the way most nights at the estate ended, quietly, and she would still have a job and a peaceful life waiting for her in the morning. That plan held together until Ethan stood to give his toast. He spoke warmly about Vanessa, about the families joining together, about a future he described in careful practiced language that guests seemed to expect from a man in his position. Halfway through the speech, though, his eyes drifted toward the back of the room, toward Naomi standing near the service entrance, with a tray balanced against one hip. It was only a second, maybe two, but something in his expression softened in a way it had not softened once during the entire toast about his own engagement. Vanessa saw it. She had spent months watching for exactly that kind of moment, and now, standing beside him in a dress worth more than most people's cars, she watched her fiancé's face change for a woman holding a serving tray instead of for her. The champagne in her glass suddenly tasted like something bitter. Every fear she had buried since the night she first noticed his ease around, Naomi rose up at once, sharpened by alcohol and audience, and the unbearable idea that she might, after everything, still not be enough. She set her glass down on the nearest table and crossed the ballroom floor, before she had fully decided what she intended to do. Naomi saw her coming but had nowhere to retreat that would not look like fleeing, so she stood still and waited. Vanessa reached her in seconds and grabbed the tray directly out of her hands, sending champagne glasses crashing to the marble in a spray of glass and gold liquid that silenced the string quartet mid-note. Conversations around the room died one by one as guests turned to see what had happened. Vanessa did not lower her voice. She announced, loud enough for at least 50 people to hear clearly, that Naomi had been using her position in the household to get close to Ethan, that she had overstepped every boundary a member of the staff should understand without being told. She said the Whitmore family had been far too generous in keeping someone like Naomi employed here, and that generosity apparently came with no gratitude in return. Naomi asked, quietly enough that only Vanessa and a few nearby guests could hear, if they could step aside and speak privately instead of continuing this in front of everyone. Vanessa refused immediately. It became clear, watching her face in that moment, that privacy was never the point. She wanted an audience. She wanted every business leader, every politician, and every camera in that room to witness Naomi's humiliation, because humiliating her felt, for a moment, like proof that Vanessa still held every advantage that mattered. She shoved Naomi with both hands, hard enough that the impact should have sent most people stumbling backward into the crowd. Naomi did not fall. She shifted her weight half a step, absorbed the force through her hips and knees the way she had been trained to do years earlier, and remained standing as though the push had barely registered. A few guests near the front exchanged glances, the first quiet signs that something about this maid did not match what they had assumed about her. Vanessa's face tightened further. Whatever reaction she had expected from Naomi, calm composure was clearly not it, and the lack of visible fear only seemed to enrage her further. She stepped in closer, raised her hand, and swung it toward Naomi's face in front of the entire ballroom. What happened next took less than a second, though for Naomi it felt like the space stretched wide enough to hold an entire decision. In that fraction of time, she thought of her old instructor's voice, the one that had told her repeatedly that strength was never about the ability to defeat someone, but about knowing exactly when to stop. She caught Vanessa's wrist in midair. In the same motion, she redirected the momentum of the swing, turned her body, and used Vanessa's own force to lift her briefly off the ground before guiding her down onto the marble floor in a controlled fall. It happened fast enough that most guests only understood what they had seen after it was already over. Vanessa landed hard enough to knock the breath from her lungs, but not hard enough to injure her, because Naomi had deliberately protected her head, neck, and spine throughout the entire motion, even while taking her down. The ballroom went completely silent. 300 people stared at a maid in a pink and white uniform who had just disarmed the host family's future daughter-in-law without so much as raising her voice. Naomi remained standing exactly where she had been, though everything about the way she held herself now told a different story than the one this room had assumed about her for years. Her spine was straight, her breathing even, her eyes steady on Vanessa in a way that had nothing submissive left in it. When Vanessa, still catching her breath on the floor, demanded to know what exactly Naomi was, the answer came without hesitation or apology. Naomi told her, and the room, that her name was Naomi Carter, and that before she had ever worn this uniform, she had spent 8 years training in martial arts and close combat defense. She explained that she had left that life behind because she wanted peace, not because she had ever lacked the ability to defend herself. She made it clear she had never wanted to reveal any of this, but she would not accept being attacked simply because someone believed her skin, her uniform, or her job made her unworthy of basic respect. From that moment forward, Naomi was no longer the invisible woman who had spent years disappearing into corners of this house. Every guest in that ballroom now saw her, whether they wanted to or not. Vanessa recovered quickly, though not in the direction anyone watching might have expected. Instead of processing what had actually happened, she stood, straightened her dress, and announced immediately that she had been assaulted. She demanded that security restrain Naomi and that someone call the police, apparently confident that her wealth and her position as the family's future bride would be enough to turn public opinion instantly in her favor. Security guards moved into the ballroom within moments, and the atmosphere shifted from stunned silence into something far more dangerous. Naomi understood immediately that a single wrong move, one flinch of resistance or one raised voice, could allow this entire situation to be rewritten into something that painted her as the aggressor. She raised both hands slowly, kept her voice level, and offered no resistance as the guards approached. That single decision cost her more than most people in the room could have understood. It meant facing a fear larger than losing her job. Vanessa was attempting to weaponize every assumption this room already carried, turning herself into a wealthy victim while recasting a skilled black maid as a threat that needed to be controlled. It was an old story dressed in new clothing, and Naomi could feel the room deciding in real time which version of events it wanted to believe. Some guests had clearly seen Vanessa attack first, their expressions shifting uneasily as security moved toward Naomi instead, but none of them spoke up. Getting involved meant risking their own standing within a social circle that valued discretion over accuracy, and most chose silence over the possibility of being pulled into a Whitmore family scandal. It was Ethan who finally crossed the room and ordered security to stand down. He turned to Naomi, visibly shaken, and asked why she had never told him any of this before tonight. Naomi answered honestly, telling him that once people learned what she was capable of, they usually stopped seeing the rest of her. They saw a threat instead of a person, and she had chosen an ordinary life specifically because she wanted to be judged by her character, not by other people's fear. Vanessa was not finished. She threatened publicly to press charges against Naomi, promising that she would make certain no wealthy family in Boston would ever hire her again once this was over. Several guests had already begun filming with their phones, capturing fragments of the confrontation that, taken out of context, could easily be shaped into a story where Naomi appeared to be the one who had started the violence. Naomi understood, standing there under the weight of dozens of raised phones, that a single misleading headline could destroy everything she had built. It would not matter that Vanessa had attacked first. It would only matter what story spread fastest, and stories about dangerous maids attacking wealthy fiancés tended to spread far quicker than the truth ever could. She thought about the peaceful life she had constructed so carefully since walking away from her old training, a life now standing on the edge of collapse in front of 300 witnesses. Her past had been exposed, her job was almost certainly gone, and her reputation could be destroyed within hours regardless of what had actually happened. She also understood something more painful still. Ethan, however sincere his concern looked in this moment, would likely be unable to publicly choose her over his own family, his shareholders, and the woman he was supposed to marry. Naomi took one slow breath in the stretched silence that followed, surrounded by phones and stares and the wreckage of shattered champagne glasses at her feet, and realized, for the first time in years, that she was no longer afraid of losing her job. She was afraid of disappearing again, of shrinking herself back into invisibility simply to make everyone else in this room more comfortable. She reached down, untied her apron, and set it gently on the floor beside the broken glass. She did not apologize for defending herself, but standing there in front of the very people who had never once truly seen her, she understood, with a quiet and painful clarity, that she might once again have to walk away from a life she had worked so hard to build, all because of someone else's fear and someone else's need to feel superior. In that moment, surrounded by silence and shattered crystal, Naomi believed she had already lost everything that mattered. Naomi had barely turned toward the service doors when a voice cut through the silence of the ballroom, steady and unhurried despite belonging to a man well past his 90th year. Harold Whitmore stood from his chair near the head table, one hand resting on his cane, and announced that he had witnessed every part of what had just happened. The room, still frozen from the spectacle of broken glass and raised phones, turned toward him instead. Harold stated plainly that Vanessa had grabbed the tray from Naomi's hands, shoved her twice, and thrown the first strike of the evening. He said Naomi had only defended herself after trying repeatedly to avoid the confrontation altogether. His voice did not rise, but it carried the kind of authority that came from decades of being the one person in every room whose word was rarely questioned. He asked the security guards standing near Naomi to step back, and they did so immediately. Then Harold reminded the room of something he had said months earlier at a private family dinner, a comment that had gone almost unnoticed at the time. He had told his family then that the way a person treated those who served them revealed more about their character than any introduction ever could. Tonight, he said, that truth had been proven in the ugliest way he could have imagined, and he would not stand by and watch it be twisted into something else. He pointed out one detail he considered more important than anything else that had happened that night. Naomi clearly possessed the skill to have injured Vanessa seriously during that fall, yet she had deliberately protected her head, her neck, and her spine throughout the entire motion. That was not the behavior of someone attacking out of rage. It was the behavior of someone disciplined enough to control an outcome most people in that room could never have controlled themselves. A young server standing near the kitchen entrance found the courage to speak next, confirming everything Harold had described. Once she spoke, something shifted in the room, as though her voice had given permission for others to do the same. The head chef stepped forward and admitted that Vanessa had searched Naomi's belongings without cause on more than one occasion. The house manager added that Naomi had consistently been held to standards no other staff member faced, forced to redo completed tasks and endure suspicion that had never been explained. A longtime family friend, someone who had attended Whitmore gatherings for years, admitted quietly that she had seen Vanessa shove Naomi first from where she was standing near the dessert table. Another guest, a woman who had known the family for years, said she had watched Vanessa make comments to staff before that many people in this circle had simply learned to ignore. Slowly, one voice at a time, the room's silence broke apart into testimony that told a very different story than the one Vanessa had tried to establish only minutes earlier. The final piece arrived when a guest near the back of the ballroom offered to play a video recorded on her phone from the moment Vanessa first crossed the floor. The footage showed everything clearly. The tray ripped from Naomi's hands, the shove, the slap that never landed, and the controlled fall that followed. There was no ambiguity left in what the room had witnessed. Whatever composed image Vanessa had spent years constructing collapsed completely in the space of a few recorded seconds. Ethan stood between the two women, visibly working through a decision that would define far more than just this evening. He had spent months building a life around expectations set by his family, his shareholders, and the wedding now unraveling in front of 300 witnesses. Choosing to protect Vanessa's version of events would have preserved all of it. Choosing the truth would cost him almost everything he had spent his adult life constructing. He chose the truth. Standing in the middle of the ballroom, he announced that the engagement was over, effective immediately. Vanessa's composure finally broke entirely. She accused Ethan of choosing a maid over the woman he was supposed to marry, her voice cracking with an anger that sounded, for the first time all night, genuinely unguarded rather than performed. Ethan answered that this had never been a choice between two women. It had been a choice between decency and cruelty, between truth and an image he had allowed to go unquestioned for far too long. He admitted in front of everyone that he had noticed signs of how Vanessa treated the staff long before tonight and had lacked the courage to confront any of it directly. His silence, he said, had allowed this moment to happen, and he understood now that his failure to speak up sooner had contributed to Naomi's suffering just as much as Vanessa's actions had. It was not an easy thing to admit in front of 300 guests, but he said it anyway. With no one left standing beside her, not her fiancé, not the family she had hoped to marry into, not even the guests who had once admired her effortless composure, Vanessa turned and walked out of the ballroom. She carried with her every fear she had refused to face since the night she first noticed Ethan's ease around another woman. Now the entire room had seen that fear exposed in her place, whether she had wanted them to or not. Ethan turned to Naomi and apologized, his voice quieter now that the crowd's attention had begun to loosen its grip on the room. Naomi did not offer immediate forgiveness, and she made no move toward anything resembling romance in that moment. She told him plainly that his willingness to stand beside her during one dramatic confrontation could not erase the months of silence that had come before it. If he wanted real change, she said, he would need to prove that respect for the people who worked in his home did not depend on whether they happened to matter to him personally. Harold offered to let Naomi remain at the estate, assuring her that nothing about tonight would affect her position there. Naomi thanked him, but told him gently that she had already decided to leave the household staff behind. She was not walking away in defeat. She was walking away because she no longer wanted to build her life around the practice of making herself small enough for other people's comfort. In the months that followed, Naomi used her savings, along with support from people in her community who had heard what happened that night, to open a martial arts and self-defense program for young black girls facing difficult circumstances. The program taught far more than technique. Naomi built lessons around recognizing danger early, setting firm boundaries, staying calm under pressure, and refusing to let anyone else's prejudice determine their worth. Ethan, for his part, restructured the human resources policies across the entire Whitmore Corporation, creating protections for employees that had never existed before, and taking direct responsibility for issues he had ignored for years. He supported Naomi's program often in the months that followed, but he was careful never to use money as a way of controlling her decisions or her time. Instead, he rebuilt trust slowly, through consistent action rather than grand gestures. Whatever feelings eventually grew between them developed only after Naomi saw over time that Ethan had genuinely learned to notice injustice, even when the person affected by it was not someone he loved. That distinction mattered to her more than any apology could have on its own. 1 year later, the same ballroom that had witnessed Naomi's humiliation hosted an entirely different kind of evening, a fundraiser for the self-defense center she had built from nothing. Staff members who had once stood silently along the walls during Whitmore events were seated now at tables alongside family members and honored guests, treated as equals rather than fixtures of the room. 12 girls from Naomi's first graduating class demonstrated basic self-defense techniques for the crowd, their movements precise and confident, under the same chandeliers that had once lit Vanessa's public unraveling. Among them was a girl named Chloe, who a year earlier had been too frightened to meet anyone's eyes directly, now standing tall in front of 300 guests without a trace of that old fear. After the demonstration ended, Chloe stepped forward and addressed the room herself. She said that Miss Naomi had never taught them to become dangerous. She had taught them that no one had the right to make them feel small, and that if the world ever tried to do that again, they would know exactly how to stand back up, the same way Naomi once had. Harold raised his glass in Naomi's honor, making clear that he was not celebrating her ability to defeat another person in a fight. He was celebrating the fact that she had transformed a night of public humiliation into an opportunity to hand real strength to hundreds of young women who had never been offered it before. Ethan stood near Naomi throughout the evening, careful not to take any part of the spotlight that belonged entirely to her. This was her victory, built from her own resilience and the community she had chosen to serve, not something that needed his name attached to make it meaningful. Beneath the very chandeliers that had once witnessed her deepest humiliation, Naomi stood now as neither a maid, nor a fighter, nor a billionaire's chosen companion. She stood simply as herself, a woman who had finally chosen her own worth without needing anyone else's permission to claim it. Never mistake silence for weakness. Never measure a person's value by their skin, their uniform, or the job they happen to hold. The one this room once looked past may be the very person carrying more strength, more discipline, and more dignity than anyone else standing inside it. If Naomi's story moved you tonight, don't let it end here. Subscribe to the channel so you never miss the next story of quiet strength standing back up, and tell us in the comments which moment hit you the hardest.